Right now, anything that can help the gasoline industry would be a huge benefit to those behind the wheel. When we talked with UNL Ag Economics professor Dennis Conley on Wednesday, the national gasoline average was $3.94 per gallon. We asked Dennis how this year compares to history and what the worst-case scenario would be for drivers, but started by asking about the typical movement gasoline takes during the course of a calendar year.
If we look at the seasonality of gas prices, say over the last 5 years, what we notice is starting near the end of February, the first part of March, up through the end of May, Memorial Weekend, prices generally increase. From that point on then, through the summer months, they level off for a couple of months, and then by mid-July, early August, they start to decline going into the fall and winter season. This is intuitive. I think everybody understands. You know, school's out, going on vacation, it's summertime, a lot of driving. Then you go into the fall, you know, people go back to work, less driving, and so on.
Now, how does that compare to what we're seeing? We're only in April, but how does it compare to what we've seen so far through the first 3 months and what you think we'll see as we go forward?
Yeah, if we look back historically over the last 5 years, you know, we have on a monthly average, we have a low set of prices shown by the green line. We have an average set shown by the black line, and we have the highest of the month shown by the blue line. What's happening in 2012 is, because of supply, demand, and other conditions, that the price is running about 25 cents a gallon higher. This is a Midwest average retail gasoline price.
Does it feel like it's higher than that even, because we can still remember when gas was below $2?
It feels like it because if we go back historically and we look at gasoline prices, there was about a 20-year time period from 1986 to about 2006 when we had very ample supplies of crude oil and liquid fuels in the world. And so we had relatively low prices and ample supply, and that we all got used to that. I actually call that SUV heaven. It's when you saw a lot of SUVs, you see a lot of pickup trucks, you know. People didn't worry about the price of gas. But in 2006, the world began to change.
So what's the concern this year? Why are we so high so early right now?
We're high because there's a concern that two things. The demand has caught up with the supply. That really started in about 2006, where the fundamentals, demand caught up with supply. China was part of that. But the other concern that we see now is worry about geopolitical events. And there are those of us who have historical memories going clear back to the 1970s. 1978 was when there was a revolution in Iran. And when that government turned over, their world supply of crude oil was no longer available, and that had a major impact on prices back then.
I think what some of the question is now is people are going to say there's plenty of supply, there's ample supply, why are prices so high if there's nothing going on? Yeah. Is that a fair question?
It's a fair question. You look at the fundamentals, and yes, there is ample supply. There's ample supply in the US, there's ample supply in the world, but what happens with consumers of liquid fuels and crude oil is they get concerned with geopolitical events that maybe a month from now or 2 months from now or 6 months from now, those supplies, those regular sources of supply will not be there. Countries like Japan, Europe, places that are entirely dependent on other parts of the world for their energy, so they'll go out and in anticipation of problems, they will buy crude oil and liquid fuels in advance, and that bids up the prices, even though the fundamentals say we still have plenty of crude oil and liquid fuels around.
And when does that end? When does that anticipation end? Because right now we're in April. The election doesn't end until November, so that's another part of it. But Iran, whether or not U.S. or Israel action takes place, who knows when that's going to be?
That's exactly right, and that's the answer to your question. You tell me when that's going to be, and I'll tell you when the prices will start to moderate. These geopolitical events, that's the uncertainty that comes with them. And with that uncertainty, that's why these countries and users want to acquire the supply now, so that they're never short, and that they're getting at the price now versus a higher price later. If say the geopolitical events like Iran, and we've all heard about that in the news, if that moderates and it looks less threatening, then they will, they'll back off on their anticipated demand, and we'll see the prices then come back back to a more normal range.
You mentioned demand and consumers. How much is being consumed by drivers across this country and the world?
If we start with the world, we're talking about 89 million barrels per day of liquid fuels consumption. That's gasoline, heating oil, jet fuel, all of those things. 89 million barrels per day. The U.S. Consumes about 18 million barrels per day. That's down 10% from what we did 5 years ago. China, on the other hand, consumes 10 million barrels per day, about half of what we do in the U.S. Their consumption over the last 5 years is up by 66%. The rest of the world's consumption, at about 55 million barrels per day, is up by about 10%. So you got China is the big consumer that's growing. You got the rest of the world that's growing, but you have the U.S. that, because of conservation and more efficiency in driving and things like that, our consumption is actually down.
Give me a worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario when we talk about prices?
The worst case scenario, and again, this is like a weather forecast, you know, is it going to rain or be a thunderstorm or what have you, but the worst case scenario, in my view, would be that we continue to have geopolitical events that threaten the normal channels of supply sources, Persian Gulf, Straits of Hormuz, Iran, and who knows where else. If those conditions evolve like they did back in the late 1970s, we're talking about gasoline maybe in Lincoln this summer being $4 to $4.25 a gallon. If that worst case scenario develops, $5 is not out of the question, and maybe even higher.